Southern England, January 1944. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways of British intelligence stood at the window of his requisitioned manor house in Hampshire, watching yet another American convoy roll past. He'd been counting for 20 minutes. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all in that distinctive olive drab, driven by boys who looked impossibly young and impossibly confident. The convoy showed no signs of ending. He'd stopped counting at 300 vehicles. This was the fourth such convoy he'd seen that week, and it was only Tuesday. Strangeways turned to his aide. "How many of them are there now?" he asked. The aide consulted his notes. "In Britain, sir. Last count from Chief put it at just over 1 million American personnel. That was 3 weeks ago. The number's certainly higher now." 1 million. Strangeways let the number settle. Britain's entire population was 47 million. That meant 1 American soldier for roughly every 47 British civilians. Except the Americans weren't spread evenly across the country. They were concentrated in the south, in East Anglia, anywhere within striking distance of the Channel. In some villages, American troops outnumbered British residents. The British had been fighting for 4 years. They'd stood alone against Hitler after France fell. They'd endured the Blitz, won the Battle of Britain, held North Africa, and were grinding through Italy. They'd built an army of 5 million men spread across the globe. And now, on their own island, they were being overwhelmed by an ally who'd entered the war barely 2 years ago. The realization hadn't come all at once. It had crept up on them. When the first American troops arrived in January 1942, they'd been a curiosity. The GIs who disembarked in Belfast and Liverpool were fresh-faced, enthusiastic, and startlingly well-equipped. Their uniforms were new. Their boots actually fit. They had chocolate bars and cigarettes in abundance. British soldiers, after years of rationing and shortages, watched with a mixture of welcome and envy. But there weren't many of them at first. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. The British could absorb them easily, assign them camps, show them the ropes, teach them how to make do with British rations and British weather. There was a novelty to it. American accents in village pubs, American swing music on the wireless, American money flowing into local economies. General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, noted their arrival with cautious optimism in his diary. The Americans brought manpower and industrial might. But Brooke, who'd served in the First World War and knew the cost of military incompetence, worried about their inexperience. "They have much to learn," he wrote in February 1942, "and I fear they will learn it through hard and costly lessons." He had no idea how quickly the Americans would learn, or how many of them would arrive to do the learning. Operation Bolero, the code name for the American build-up in Britain, began modestly. The plan called for steady reinforcement, building toward an eventual invasion of France. But steady became accelerating through 1943. Convoys crossed the Atlantic in growing numbers. The Americans established their own supply lines, their own command structures, their own way of doing things. By summer 1943, there were 300,000 American troops in Britain. By autumn, 500,000. The British military establishment began to notice. American camps sprouted across the countryside. Not the makeshift, make-do facilities the British had thrown together in the early war years, but proper installations with paved roads, running water, heated barracks. The Americans built with characteristic efficiency and scale. They constructed over 100,000 buildings. Nissen huts by the thousands. Workshops, hospitals, warehouses, airfields. They requisitioned country estates, converted them into headquarters, filled them with typewriters and telephones and filing cabinets. They built entire temporary cities that housed tens of thousands of men. In Tidworth, on Salisbury Plain, British officers watched American engineers transform the landscape in weeks. Where British units had trained for generations on open downs, American construction crews laid down a vast cantonment. The sound of hammering and riveting echoed across the chalk hills. Concrete mixers churned. Trucks hauled materials from dawn to dusk. A British major, seconded to work with American logistics, wrote to his wife, "They build as if they have unlimited resources, which I suppose they do." He wasn't wrong. American industrial production had reached levels that staggered the British imagination. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cleveland poured out weapons, vehicles, aircraft, ships at rates that seemed impossible. Liberty ships launched faster than U-boats could sink them. Bombers rolled off assembly lines in numbers that made the Luftwaffe's production look artisanal, and all of it flowed to Britain. By December 1943, the ports of southern England groaned under American supplies. Southampton, Plymouth, Bristol, every harbor crammed with American ships unloading American equipment for American soldiers. British dock workers who'd handled military cargo for 4 years had never seen anything like it. The scale was different. The organization was different. The Americans brought their own stevedores, their own cranes, their own systems. They brought so much food that British ration officials didn't know where to store it. American quartermaster units requisitioned warehouses, then built more warehouses when they ran out of space. The Americans ate differently. They expected fresh meat, fresh vegetables, fresh bread. They got it. Their supply chain delivered it. British soldiers, subsisting on bully, beef and hard biscuits, watched American mess tents serve steak and ice cream. The disparity was impossible to ignore. It bred resentment, jokes, and a growing awareness that this was an army operating on a different economic level entirely. Overpaid, oversexed, and over here became the bitter British quip. The Americans had a ready response. Underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. But beneath the humor lay a deeper truth. The balance of power was shifting. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British ground forces and preparing for the invasion of France, found himself in an increasingly awkward position. Montgomery was Britain's most successful field commander, the victor of El Alamein, the man who'd driven Rommel out of Africa. He expected to command the invasion. Britain had borne the weight of the war in Europe for 4 years. British planning had shaped the strategy. British intelligence had laid the groundwork. But by late 1943, the arithmetic was inescapable. American forces in Britain were approaching 1 million men. They would soon outnumber British forces. More importantly, American reinforcements kept coming while British manpower was stretched to breaking. Britain had mobilized everything it could. Every fit man between 18 and 51 was either in uniform or in essential war work. The island had given everything. America was just getting started. In December 1943, the announcement came. General Dwight Eisenhower would serve as Supreme Commander for the invasion. An American would lead the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. Montgomery would command ground forces, but under Eisenhower's overall authority. Brooke recorded his disappointment in his diary, though he understood the logic. "We are now facing the facts," he wrote, "that our American allies are rapidly becoming the dominant partner." The words were carefully chosen. Dominant partner, not equal partner. The British had fought longer, sacrificed more, held the line when it mattered most. But weight of numbers was changing everything. By January 1944, when Lieutenant Colonel Strangeways watched that endless convoy, American troops in Britain numbered 1.2 million. By March, 1.4 million. By May, as D-Day approached, 1.5 million. The southern counties of England had become an American armed camp. In Dorset, Devon, Cornwall, Hampshire, Sussex, Kent, everywhere within reach of embarkation ports, American divisions trained, equipped, and prepared. The roads filled with their convoys, the skies filled with their aircraft, the fields filled with their tanks and artillery. In some areas, the transformation was total. East Anglia, where the flat terrain suited airfield construction, became particularly American. The 8th Air Force built over 100 airfields across Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. American bomber crews flew from British fields, but they lived in American bubbles. They had their own clubs, their own post exchanges, their own movie theaters showing Hollywood films. British civilians found themselves strangers in their own villages. In Great Ashfield, Suffolk, the American air base employed more people than the village had residents. The Americans brought jobs, money, excitement. They also brought noise, traffic, and a casual disregard for British class distinctions that both charmed and unsettled their hosts. The cultural impact rippled through British society in ways no one had anticipated. American soldiers earned 3 times what British privates earned. They had access to luxuries, cigarettes, chocolate, nylon stockings that had vanished from British shops years ago. They were generous with these luxuries, especially around young British women. British men, particularly British soldiers, watched their girlfriends and sisters gravitate toward the well-fed, well-paid, confident Americans. The resentment was real and sometimes violent. Military police from both armies dealt with regular brawls in pubs and dance halls. The Americans called it friction. The British called it the Yank problem. But for British military planners, the real problem was strategic. How do you maintain influence when your ally is providing the majority of the force? The final numbers for D-Day itself were telling. On June 6, 1944, the initial assault waves were roughly balanced. 73,000 Americans landing at Utah and Omaha beaches, 83,000 British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. The British could point to this balance, could argue they were still equal partners in the Great Crusade. But everyone knew what came next. Behind those initial waves stood the full weight of American mobilization. Divisions upon divisions, corps upon corps, armies upon armies. By the end of June, over 1 million American troops would be in France. By the end of the summer, 2 million. By the end of the war, over 3 million American soldiers would serve in the European theater. British forces would peak at around 1 million in France, then decline as manpower shortages bit deeper. Britain had mobilized everything. America was still ramping up. The British generals who'd watched this build-up understood what it meant. Some accepted it with grace, others struggled with the implications. All recognized that the war's outcome would reshape global power in ways that went far beyond defeating Hitler. Major General Sir Frederick Morgan, who'd served as chief planner for the invasion before Eisenhower's arrival, captured the moment in a report to the War Office. "We are witnessing," he wrote, "the arrival of a force that will not only liberate Europe, but will fundamentally alter the balance of world power. The Americans have brought an army to our shores that exceeds anything in our history or imagination. They have done so with a speed and efficiency that demonstrates capabilities we cannot match." Morgan wasn't being defeatist. He was being realistic. Britain had fought magnificently, had held civilization's line when it mattered most. But the arithmetic of modern industrial warfare favored the nation with the largest factories, the most resources, the deepest reserves of manpower. In Salisbury, where American troops trained for the invasion, a British liaison officer named Captain Richard Pym watched an entire American armored division conduct maneuvers. 250 tanks, hundreds of half-tracks and trucks, thousands of men moving in coordinated waves across the downs. The earth shook with their passage. The noise was overwhelming. Pym had served in North Africa with the 8th Army. He'd seen Montgomery's forces at their peak. This was different. This was industrial warfare at a scale he hadn't imagined possible. "How many divisions like this do they have?" he asked the American colonel beside him. "In Britain right now, 15 armored divisions plus infantry, airborne and support units. Back in the States, we're still training them. We'll have 100 divisions mobilized by year's end." 100 divisions. Britain had fielded perhaps 20 divisions at peak strength, and that had required total mobilization of a nation of 47 million. America, with a population of 130 million and an industrial base that dwarfed Britain's, was building an army that would make Britain's contribution look modest by comparison. The psychological impact on British military leadership was profound. These were men who'd grown up in an empire that spanned the globe, who'd been taught that Britain was the world's dominant military power. They'd commanded forces in India, Africa, the Middle East. They'd seen themselves as the natural leaders of any coalition. Now they found themselves junior partners to a nation they'd once dismissed as militarily insignificant. Brooke's diary entries through 1944 track this adjustment. Early in the year, he still wrote with frustration about American inexperience, about their tendency to learn lessons the British had already absorbed. But as the months passed, his tone shifted. He began noting American competence, American efficiency, American scale. After visiting American training exercises in April 1944, he wrote, "Whatever doubts I had about American military capability are being rapidly dispelled. They are learning fast, and they have resources we simply cannot match. The balance of this alliance has shifted irreversibly." That word, irreversibly, captured the moment. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't just about winning the war. This was about the post-war world, about which nation would emerge as the dominant power. Churchill understood this better than anyone. The Prime Minister had spent years cultivating the Anglo-American alliance, had courted Roosevelt, had argued for American entry into the war, but Churchill also understood that bringing America fully into the war meant accepting American dominance. In conversations with his military chiefs, Churchill was frank. "We cannot match their numbers," he told them in March 1944. "We cannot match their production. We must ensure we maintain influence through strategic wisdom and military competence. We must be indispensable even if we cannot be dominant." It was a remarkable admission from the leader of an empire that still controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass. But Churchill was a realist. He saw the numbers. He understood what they meant. The ordinary British soldiers saw it too, in more immediate ways. They saw American equipment that was newer, better, more abundant. They saw American rations that included luxuries British troops hadn't tasted in years. They saw American confidence that came from knowing their nation's full weight hadn't yet been committed. A British sergeant, training alongside American troops in Devon, wrote in his diary, "The Yanks have everything: new rifles, new boots, new uniforms. They waste ammunition in training like it's free, which, for them, I suppose it is. They'll throw 1,000 shells at a target we'd attack with 100, and they'll do it again tomorrow and the day after. They have so much of everything that they don't need to conserve anything." This abundance wasn't just material. It was psychological. American soldiers carried themselves differently. They hadn't endured 4 years of rationing, 4 years of bombing, 4 years of casualty lists. They were fresh, energetic, optimistic. They believed they would win because they'd never seriously considered the alternative. British soldiers, who'd lived with the possibility of defeat for years, found this confidence both inspiring and slightly irritating. The Americans hadn't earned their optimism through hard experience. They'd inherited it from a nation that hadn't been touched by war on its home soil. But that confidence, backed by overwhelming material superiority, was exactly what the invasion needed. Montgomery, whatever his personal feelings about American command, recognized this. The assault on Hitler's fortress Europe required not just courage, but resources on a scale only America could provide. The final staging for D-Day revealed the full scope of American commitment. In ports and camps across southern England, over 1.5 million men prepared to cross the Channel. The Americans provided roughly 60% of the ground forces, 70% of the aircraft, and the vast majority of the supplies. British logistics officers, who'd been managing scarcity for 4 years, watched American supply dumps with something approaching awe. Mountains of ammunition, warehouses of rations, fuel depots that stretched for acres, medical supplies in quantities that seemed excessive until you remembered the scale of the operation. An American supply colonel, asked by his British counterpart how they'd accumulated so much material, shrugged. We just kept shipping it. Every convoy that crossed the Atlantic brought more. We figured it was better to have too much than too little. Too much was a concept British planners had almost forgotten. They'd spent 4 years calculating minimum requirements, stretching resources, making do with less. The Americans operated from abundance. They oversupplied as a matter of policy. This difference in approach extended to casualties. British planners, conscious of their limited manpower, designed operations to minimize losses. Every British soldier killed or wounded was irreplaceable. The British Army was already scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel, reducing the size of divisions, consolidating units. The Americans could afford to be more aggressive. Not that they were careless with their soldiers' lives, but they knew reinforcements were available. Behind the divisions in Britain stood more divisions in America. Behind those stood training camps full of new recruits. The pipeline was full and flowing. This reality shaped command decisions in ways both subtle and profound. When Eisenhower and Montgomery planned the invasion, they knew the Americans would absorb the majority of casualties in the long campaign ahead. Not because American lives mattered less, but because American reserves were deeper. By late May 1944, with D-Day imminent, the transformation of Britain was complete. The island had become a massive military base, and that base was predominantly American. British civilians had grown accustomed to American accents, American vehicles, American music. The American presence had become normal. But for British military leaders, the adjustment was still ongoing. They were learning to operate in an alliance where they were no longer the dominant partner, where their voice carried weight through experience and wisdom rather than through sheer force of numbers. General Miles Dempsey, who would command British ground forces under Montgomery, met with his American counterparts regularly in the weeks before D-Day. He found them competent, professional, and increasingly confident. He also found them very aware of their numerical superiority. In one planning session, an American general suggested a modification to the invasion plan that would shift resources from British to American sectors. Dempsey objected, arguing the change was unnecessary and would complicate coordination. The American listened politely, then noted that American forces would be providing the majority of the follow-up divisions and should therefore have priority in resource allocation. Dempsey couldn't argue with the logic. The Americans weren't being arrogant. They were stating facts. They had more divisions, more supplies, more of everything. Those facts gave them leverage. This was the new reality British generals faced. They could influence decisions through expertise and experience, but they couldn't dictate outcomes through force of numbers. The Americans were too numerous, too well-equipped, too confident. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when the invasion fleet crossed the Channel, it carried the largest amphibious force in history. British planning and British experience had shaped the operation. British intelligence had mapped the defenses. British innovation had created specialized armor for the assault. But American power made it possible. American industry had built the landing craft, the trucks, the aircraft, the weapons. American factories had produced the ammunition, the fuel, the rations. American manpower filled the majority of the divisions that would fight across France. Standing on the deck of HMS Scylla as the fleet approached Normandy, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, the British naval commander, watched the armada spread across the horizon. British ships, American ships, Canadian ships, moving together toward the beaches. But the sheer scale of the American contribution was impossible to miss. Ramsay had spent his career in the Royal Navy, the service that had dominated the world's oceans for 2 centuries. He understood what he was witnessing. British naval supremacy had been absolute. Now, in this fleet, American vessels outnumbered British. The Americans had built a navy in 3 years that rivaled what Britain had accumulated over centuries. The same pattern would repeat on land. British and Canadian forces would fight with courage and skill through the Normandy campaign. They would take heavy casualties, would achieve crucial objectives, would prove their worth as battlefield partners. But American numbers would prove decisive. American divisions would break out from the beachhead, would liberate Paris, would drive toward Germany. By the end of the war in Europe, American forces would number over 3 million men. British forces would be declining towards 700,000. The disparity would be even more stark in the Pacific, where the war against Japan was almost entirely an American show. The British generals who'd watched the American build-up through 1943 and 1944 understood they were witnessing a fundamental shift in global power. Britain had fought magnificently, had held the line when it mattered most, had contributed crucial intelligence, experience, and courage. But the outcome of the war would be determined by American industrial might and American manpower. What they said in their diaries, their reports, their private conversations, was remarkably consistent. They expressed admiration for American efficiency, concern about American inexperience, frustration with American confidence, and acceptance of American dominance. They recognized that the alliance had saved Britain, but had also revealed Britain's limitations. Brooke, in a diary entry written after the war, reflected on those years. "We welcomed the Americans as saviors," he wrote, "which they were. But we failed to fully grasp that being saved meant accepting a new order. The Americans came to Britain in numbers we could not have imagined, with resources we could not match, and with a confidence born of industrial supremacy. They learned quickly, fought well, and emerged from the war as the world's dominant power. We should not be surprised by this outcome. We invited them to come. They came in overwhelming force. They changed everything." That was what British generals said in the end, when they saw the true size of America's army. They said it had changed everything, and they were right.